here at the system level, okay? So remember, there are the two places, okay? We've got that systemic gas exchange, the one that's taking place at the tissue level. So now, if we kind of flip this and look at it at the area, the second area, the next area, the alveoli, all right? Now, here's what we get this time. All right, so we're going to have our capillary with the blood. Don't forget that we've got this respiratory membrane, and this respiratory membrane has that fluid film of the water, all right? At this point, our goal, get rid of the CO2, pick up the oxygen. So the CO2, it's traveling, once again, in these three ways. It's traveling as that dissolved gas, but a very small amount, okay? So the CO2, this small amount, can travel past that membrane. We have the little bit that will be attached to a plasma membrane. So what will happen? That CO2 gets released. Now, this time, notice what begins to happen in the process for the majority of the CO2. What do you notice now about the arrows versus the other picture? We're now reversed. So let's look at it this time. Goal, pick up oxygen. Look at the amount of the oxygen that's going to go into that red blood cell and attach to the hemoglobin. If the oxygen attaches to the hemoglobin, now watch this process. We form the oxyhemoglobin. We have an H+. Remember the bicarbs that were in there? Now look at this. H+ binds to a bicarb. We get the carbonic acid. In the presence of the carbonic anhydrase, we break it down into a water molecule, CO2. CO2 goes and moves across. Is that not the coolest ever for these gases, for these processes? And the entire time having everything stay buffered for the pH, which is really kind of interesting. So do the two pictures now kind of make sense?
They're exactly opposite.
They're exactly opposite. I think it's just really cool, this process that's being created for the passage of the gases.
And it says alveolar air, so it's in...
It'll be in an alveolus, in a little grate.
In just one.
Mhm. And this is happening at all of them, for the most part, unless we have a shunt pass it by. So what's the body going to do? The body, it's going to adjust this process to meet metabolic needs. Not every tissue of your body is metabolically active 24/7. Some of the tissues are more active than others. So what the body will do is it will respond to the needs of the tissues. And what it does is it will want to work at the tissues that have been metabolically active. And if they've been metabolically active, they've created the CO2. So the CO2 has risen in those tissues. Receptors pick that up. We may need to increase our respiration rate. We increase the blood flow. We increase the, do you see what I'm talking about? Meeting those metabolic needs. So the way that it gets affected, well, it gets affected by the pressure of oxygen. What is the demand at that tissue level for oxygen? If it's a high demand, then we're going to have a high amount of CO2, high amount of pressure, and we need to get oxygen into those tissues. Temperature. When temperature goes up, for example, we begin to exercise. we increase the temperature of our body. Have you ever paid attention to how the respiration rate matches that? Okay? And if it's matching that, it's going to match it. That means we're going to affect the heart rate, we're going to affect the kidneys, we're going to affect digestion, we're going to be affecting all these other systems. We have something called the Bohr effect, and if we have tissues that are active and they're creating CO2, the CO2, as we've seen, increases H pluses. If we increase H plus, we affect the pH. If we affect the pH of the blood, what are we going to want dropped off? Because right here, I'm dealing with CO2, and if I'm affecting the tissues, I need what to be dropped off? Oxygen. All right? So, it's like this cycle. We increase the CO2, increase the H, lower the pH, we increase the release of oxygen at those tissues. In the red blood cells do not have mitochondria, but the red blood cells are very busy. So the only way that they can generate their energy is with anaerobic respiration. A product, an intermediate for anaerobic respiration, well, I guess I should say fermentation. Anaerobic fermentation is this chemical right here in the red blood cell. It's called BPG. The reason that I'm telling you about this is because it is clinically significant. It can be tested. All right? When our metabolism increases, meaning we've done something to increase the metabolic needs of those tissues, there's a higher production of BPG. If BPG is increased in production in the red blood cell, that can promote oxygen release at the tissue level. Everything's based on what is that metabolic need at the tissue level. The CO2, with the CO2, this carbon dioxide loading, because if we're at the tissue level, we want to load CO2 into that red blood cell. So we have what's called the Haldane effect, basically saying if we create CO2, it's going to affect or promote transport of more CO2. It's like I wouldn't call it a positive feedback cycle because I don't want to go there with it, okay? But if we're producing the CO2, we need more CO2 to be picked up, oxygen dropped off, so the CO2 itself promotes picking up CO2 in the blood. And it's called the Haldane effect. So, the last thing to finish off this chapter, like I said before, the overall goal of breathing, of respiration, is to make sure that we maintain the pH of the brain, that we do not affect the pH of the fluid of the brain. What is that fluid?
CSF.
Our CSF, the cerebrospinal fluid. So we're going to have receptors. They're going to be able to monitor the composition of the cerebrospinal fluid. The most potent chemical that will affect it is pH. So if something happens to the pH in the blood, the chemoreceptors, the medulla oblongata, where the respiratory center is, will begin to affect respiration. Now, since pH is based off of these H pluses, well, for the cerebrospinal fluid, H pluses cannot make it across that blood-brain barrier because H pluses would severely affect the cerebrospinal fluid. So what happens is it'll have to monitor CO2. Why? because CO2 gives me the production of H pluses. Does that make sense? So if it can monitor the CO2, it's monitoring the H pluses. All right? So cerebrospinal fluid cannot buffer the H pluses, so we need to make sure that we buffer the CO2 in the blood. And we do that by either increasing or decreasing our respiration rate. Because we affect the CO2 by the O2, O2 affected by the CO2, both of them dealing with H pluses. Yes, no, maybe? All right, so if we can affect the respiration rate, we are going to affect the H pluses. Now, CO2, it has a little bit of an effect on our respiration rate, mostly only at the beginning of exercise. The rest of the time, we're looking at H pluses. H pluses are very determinant in our respiration rate. Oxygen, believe it or not, that's the last thing that affects our respiration rate. Now, if we get to a situation where the oxygen levels get really low, like, if we think about the millimeters of mercury of the air around us, then oxygen is a determining factor of respiration rate. But overall, the biggest indicator about your respiration rate is what are the H pluses? What is the pH of the blood? So the pH of the blood should be roughly 7.45. What if it just simply drops down to 7.35? Is that a problem? If it goes over 7.45, is that a problem? Yes. Both of them can be life-threatening. So you're going to come across something that's termed acidosis, alkalosis, okay? Acidosis, well, like the name says, the pH has dropped. It has gone from 7.4 down, all right? If it gets to just lower than 7.35, now 7.45 to 7.35 doesn't sound like a lot, but remember, the pH scale is logarithmic, okay? So that little tiny change is huge in H pluses, okay? So this is going to be acidosis. And the most common cause you'll read is a term called hypercapnia, okay? And basically, CO2 levels are too high, and we've got to breathe to get it back down.
Hyper what?
Hypercapnia. Now, under alkalosis, when it swings the opposite direction, this one, hypocapnia. Usually, the pH goes above the 7.45. CO2 is not enough. Once again, we're going to breathe to try to bring it back into correct pH balance. And that means that these are termed either respiratory acidosis or respiratory alkalosis. Two very common terms that you're going to come across in your clinicals. Another type of term that you're going to come across, because diabetes is so prevalent, in our society, people who have diabetes mellitus, one of the things that happens, they can produce these ketone bodies, and in doing that, it lowers the pH of the blood. And this is going to be termed ketoacidosis. This is not good. The diabetes patients who suffer from this, they basically have very deep and labored breathing, all right? And what's happening is they're basically hungry for air because their body has been so affected by the pH changes. So these will be some very common disorders that you'll see as you move into your clinicals. That's it, 22. Y'all can work until about 1:20, 1:30, and I'll see you tomorrow.